Hey, this is Big John Summers, and I want to thank you so much for listening to the Tennessee History Nerd. By the way, if you enjoyed this episode, I want you to know that there's a lot more content waiting for you out there. We're adding new episodes every week, and we're working our way across the whole state of Tennessee, covering stories from prehistory all the way into the 20th century. So if you like Tennessee history, there's already a catalog of stories out there for you to explore. So, scroll back through those previous episodes. You might just find something you weren't expecting. And again, thanks so much for listening. Okay, so really excited about what I have going on today. This has kind of been one of those situations. I'll give a little background here before we get actually into the interview. But when I was actually researching episode 6, which was about the life of David Farragut, I went into the Farragut Museum in Farragut, Tennessee. Was completely focused on that mission. Was all set to really, look at all the exhibits that they have there, and the docent was wanting to talk to me, and I really didn't want to talk to him. I wanted to get right into the exhibits, was kind of excited about being there. And there were these two gentlemen there talking with the docent, and one of them is my guest today. And that just, this is just one of those things where, sometimes random events happen, and they happen just in such a marvelous way. It's very, very providential. In this case, Norman Shaw was there, and Norman is very much involved in the work of remembering the Sultana disaster. And that is the subject of episode 10. Of course, when he and I started talking, and I realized, what a gift I had been given, of course, I knew I was going to have to get Norman on to talk to him and make sure that, took the opportunity to pick his brain and get all of the things that he could share with us. And that's exactly what I'm doing today. We have Norman Shaw with us. And Norman, I'm going to leave it up to you to explain exactly what it is that you do and the involvement that you have. And then we're going to get right into all the things that you have to talk about with regard to how you're working to remember what is the worst maritime disaster in the history of the United States. Found out that is indeed the case, even with the changes in numbers with Gene Soliker's work that he's done to identify exactly how many people did die. It's still the worst disaster in United States history, even when you factor in those changes. So welcome to the show, Norman. So glad to have you with us.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here. Thanks for the invitation. And that was a great moment at the Farragut Museum. When Fred and I bumped into you, you were there when it opened, right on the dot like we were, and you had a mission. But when we found out what you did, we had to tell you something about the history of Farragut, and I was pleased to point you in the right direction to where Farragut was born. And I listened to that podcast this week. I really, really enjoyed it. I thought you did a great job.
Thank you.
So we did mention about the Sultana, and I have been started the Association of Sultana Descendants and Friends back in 1988, and I stumbled across the story because I was a member of the Knoxville Civil War Roundtable, and the lady who was working down the East Tennessee Historical Society mentioned this lady called a real daughter whose dad was on the Sultana. And I thought, well, that sounds interesting. I didn't know what the Sultana was. And so I found a book called Transport to Disaster, which is actually the first, I'll call it, researched book on the Sultana in the library, McClung Library. And it's a fascinating story. It's like, you look at it like, is this real? Is this fiction? What, can this really have happened? This great tragedy and all the terrible deaths. But it was real. And then from that same lady, I met another gentleman, found out about him. He was a real son. And his dad was on the Sultana and survived it. So I said, I really have to follow up this story. But let me back up a little bit. Actually, my first exposure to the Sultana was this lady called Mrs. Malcolm Bloom, coming to a meeting of the Knoxville Civil War Roundtable. I started that in 1983. And I just have a great memory of that. She kind of wandered into our meeting, and she knew where we were meeting. And you can imagine a lady like in her late 80s, early 90s on a cane, well-dressed, and says, "I'd like to speak to whoever's in charge." So they directed her to me, and I said hello and introduced myself. She said, "You need to find out about the Sultana. You need to learn about that since you're a Civil War organization. And there's a beautiful monument over in South Knoxville you need to get to visit. You should visit." So I remembered that, and that's actually was my first experience meeting her. And then I found the book in the McClung collection. Okay, then I heard about Mr. Keeble. His name is Silas Keeble, the real son. And I just by good fortune, I knew that this would be a good story. So I called the local newspaper, the Knoxville News Sentinel, and I said, "I think I got a good story here. Do you have anybody who can cover it?" He said, "We just had a guy move in from Memphis. His name's Fred Brown, and he knows about the Sultana. His good buddy is Jerry Potter, who is, as we'll get to later, immersed in the Sultana. He's a practicing attorney in Memphis, back in the I guess late 70s, early 80s.
And thanks to you, I had the opportunity to speak to him last night. So yes.
We're both still involved after 40-some years.
Right.
And he's a good friend. So I talked to the reporter named Fred Brown, and they agreed with the story. So I went with him to see Mr. Keeble, and never had met him before. And he was very pleasant. Again, he's also in his 90s. It's hard to believe that in 1987 that, somebody is still alive whose dad was in the Civil War. But they were, and there was a fair amount of them. And I found Mrs. Malcolm Bloom and Mr. Ples Keeble. And then before many more years passed, we found about 8 more because the organization got started. And, of course, they're all passed on now, but it was a great honor to meet these people. And so the reporter did a story, and it was going to be coming out on Sunday, a Sunday edition, a few days later. And I said, "Fred, can you put," and I didn't know Fred real well. It was the first time I met him. I said, "Can you put a little article in there, a little notice about if anybody wants to start the Sultana Descendants Association, meet me at the Sultana Monument at 3 o'clock Sunday." And the paper's coming out on Sunday. So he did. And, of course, I still have that article. And I went out to the monument where I knew where it was, and to my great surprise and excitement, there were like 50 people milling around like, "Okay, we're here. Now what? Who's in charge?" So I took their names and phone numbers, no emails, no internet back then. And I said, "I will contact you next year. We'll start having reunions," because the men themselves had reunions starting about the late 1800s. And, of course, they're all gone. But so we need to start a reunion of the descendants. So this all happened in 1987. So in 1988 rolls around, April, I start, which is the anniversary of the disaster, of course, on April 27th. And I contacted people and invited them, and we had more of a formal meeting. That's why I say we really started our organization in 1988, although we had that informal one in 1987. And so we've been meeting ever since. And we've had about 38 reunions. We meet once a year. And this is how our association got started. Now, the first 14 years, we're here in Knoxville because people are surprised we have this strong connection. These 2 individuals that I just mentioned, their dad was the 3rd Tennessee Cavalry from the Knoxville area. And from the Knox County and the surrounding counties, Union men joined up with the Union Army and formed the 3rd Tennessee Cavalry. Now, there was other units that fought for the North, but this is the one that I'm interested in because they ended up on the Sultana. They were captured en masse by a raid by Forrest, General Nathan Bedford Forrest, that most people know about, or the Confederacy. The Wizard of the Saddle, I think his title was, his nickname, and he captured them on what's called the Railroad Raid in September 1864, and it captured the entire regiment. A few might have got away. And what happened is there was a fort in Athens, Alabama, where he started this railroad raid. And what he was trying to do, he was trying to cut off supplies to keep Sherman from capturing Atlanta. But Atlanta had already fallen, so it really made no sense, but that was his orders. As I recall, Atlanta fell September 2nd, 1864. And he starts this, that's about when he started his raid. But anyway, he's going up through there, tearing up tracks and causing havoc, which he's pretty good at. So he has a fort in Athens, Alabama, and it's in northern Alabama, called Fort Henderson. And Forrest had a lot of tricks up his sleeves, and he convinced the colonel in charge of that fort that he had like 3 times as many men as he actually had. And he said, "You have no chance, you need to surrender." And he actually took that officer out and showed him his men, the Confederate men marching by. But what the officer didn't know, that these men would go behind somewhere where they couldn't see him, and they would change from like cavalry to infantry and infantry to cavalry. So he convinced it was Colonel Campbell that he had 3 times as many men that he had. So Colonel surrendered, upsetting most of his officers, of course. Part of the 3rd Tennessee Cavalry was there. About 2 miles up the railroad track, there was another small fort guarding the railroad, Sulphur Creek Trestle, and this one, the commander was not so gullible and would not surrender, so Forrest had to just, set up his cannon and just bombard him into submission. And that's where the rest of the 3rd Tennessee Cavalry was, because they had been out hunting for Forrest, and when the Athens fell, that's their only area of protection. Let's come back to that fort. So that's what happened to the 3rd Tennessee Cavalry. And they ended up Cahaba Prison, which is near Selma. Pretty bad prison that a lot of people don't know about. It was not as infamous as Andersonville, which is in Georgia, but this is in Alabama. And they was packed in this former tobacco warehouse and had about 3,000 men. It was not pleasant. They were crowded. They had probably I think somebody figured up, they had maybe 12 square feet per person of space, and that's like 2 feet by 6 feet. That's not a lot of space to move around in. And so they lost them in there, and then they eventually were exchanged. What was left of the men from Andersonville and Cahaba were exchanged by going to an exchange camp, a parole camp outside Vicksburg. And in case people don't know what that means, exchange, in the Civil War, the northern prisoners would be traded with the southern prisoners one-on-one, private for a private, captain for a captain, colonel for a colonel. So that brings us up to the story of how they got on the Sultana.
If you're a business with a strong connection to history, education, travel, or place-based storytelling, and you're looking to reach an audience that values those things, we should talk. You can reach me at john.summers@summersmediaenterprises.com. Now, let's get back to our story. And they ended up at, it was Camp Fisk.
Camp Fisk, yes. It was a really intelligent compromise. The Confederacy was starving. They couldn't feed their own people, let alone prisoners. And, it took them off their hands. They sent these prisoners to Camp Fisk, which was 4 miles east of Vicksburg. They were still technically under the control of the Confederacy, but they were within reach of easy supplies and uniforms and those things they needed to recover, because they were in pretty bad shape after 4 or 5 months in a Confederate prisoner of war camp. So they were there a few weeks, maybe 6 weeks. They got there early March, and then plans were, the war was ending. While they were there, Lincoln was assassinated. Talk about probably here a little bit later, but Lincoln pops up 2 or 3 times in the story of the Sultana. But he was assassinated, and then it was the Confederates thought, well, this time we need to leave, and they left the guys there, and so they were not technically exchanged, but in all practical purposes they were. And then later the idea was to send these guys home, because now we're into April, and Lee had surrendered April the 9th, and the war is coming to a conclusion. You need to get these guys home. And they did that by contracting private steamboats and putting them on the steamboats and paying a certain amount to the captains, which was a really kind of a windfall. Something they did all through the war when they're transporting troops around, but now we're trying to send them home. So this was the plan, and it wasn't a bad plan. If you look on a map, you'll see that Andersonville is pretty much on the 2/3 down the state of Alabama. It's pretty much in line with Cahaba, and you keep going to the Mississippi. They're all pretty much in line going from east to west. So it made sense.
They were in the deep south.
Deep south. That's why they put the prisons there, so they couldn't be,
Even if they escaped, they had a long way to go to get to friendly lines, presumably.
Yeah, that, and then the Union Army was very interested in trying to free these camps, but it was hard to get that far south.
Right.
So that's what they did, and then they sent them over to Vicksburg. Had not that long a time of recovery, really, and they had diseases and dysentery and weakness from lack of food and all these bad things that comes out of a prisoner of war camp. And so they got them healthy as much as they could, and the decision was made to go upriver. The idea was to load them up to Vicksburg, and that's a really critical, important inland port on the Mississippi River, because
Right.
we know about how hard it was to capture
Right.
Vicksburg by Grant, who finally captured it. And
Right.
he surrendered on July the 4th, 1863. So it's a major port, and there's steamboats coming and going all the time. Now the Mississippi River's been opened up. Commerce is going on all the time, and the Sultana was coming up from its run. Its run was from St. Louis down to New Orleans and back. So it was coming back, and the captain knew those prisoners were there, and he knew the money's there too to be had if he could get them on his boat. So he was really interested in that. So they started loading them up, and this is where things start going wrong as far as the Sultana goes. Now, let me say this. I probably should have started with this, but what is the Sultana disaster? Maybe that'd been a good place to start, but anyway. The Sultana disaster, as you mentioned, is the worst maritime disaster in American history. It's this steamboat, the Sultana, that I just touched on, blew up in the middle of the Mississippi River, April 27th, 1865 at 2 a.m., about 7 miles above Memphis. And it was heavily overloaded. You had about 80 to 100 passengers, 80 to 100 crew. But it ended up, there was about 2,000 of these POWs from Camp Fisk that was put on board.
And if I remember correctly, the max capacity it was supposed to have was like 376, I think is what it was.
376, and that's right. And
they had over 2,000.
Yes. Now, it wasn't unusual to put 1,000 troops on a steamboat because they had a lot of room. They're all the time going down the river with heavy loads of commerce like cotton bales and other things, a lot of cargo. So they had to have a lot of space. So instead of regular cargo, they had human cargo, POW. So they had
Right.
places to put them. They could carry 1,000 easy, basically on the hurricane deck, which basically is the top roof, and then they had the cabin deck out in front, had a big area. So they were made to put cargo on, and so it would just end up being soldiers. So 1,000 was not any problem.
Right, but to be very clear here, and this is something that becomes later on. I don't know if you'll be touching on this or not, but it becomes a factor later on. The cargo was normally carried in the hold.
Part of it.
Right, but a big part of it, and you needed that from a standpoint of balance for the craft. You needed stuff down low, so they would have stuff in the hold that would be there would be some that would be on the lower decks as well, but putting everybody on the hurricane deck on that top level, if you don't have stuff in the hold, it becomes very top heavy.
Yeah, it is top heavy. Now they were on that. Though there was a certain amount there were hundreds, but there were also hundreds in the front of the boat and in the rear of the boat, and just where they could squeeze them in. So here's what happened. Here's how the Sultana became overly loaded. The captain, James Mason, was the captain of the Sultana, and he, as I said, he wanted to get these men. The Sultana was owned by several men, and they weren't doing too good financially. All the steamboats, and there was plenty of them, go up down the river doing the same things, delivering cargo and passengers, picking them up and delivering them. And so they interested in the money. So he, coming down the river from St. Louis, Cairo, down to Memphis and Vicksburg, he visited with the quartermaster there, and his name was Reuben Hatch. And Reuben Hatch was not an honest person. And he stayed in the Army as a quartermaster because he had political connections. His brother was the Secretary of State of Illinois, and who's the other famous person from Illinois at the time is President Lincoln, who's good friends with his brother, and Lincoln had to step in a time or two to keep Hatch from being court-martialed. Without going into a lot of details, that's where we are. But he was basically a crook, and so he always looking for opportunities to make money, and Mason wanted to make money, so it's I don't think there's a smoking gun, but there's heavy evidence, especially in Jerry Potter's book, that they did meet when Mason was coming down the river and had a powwow, and it felt like they had an understanding. Like basically, Hatch said, "I'll give you all these men, and you give me a bit of a kickback."
Some quid pro quo going on.
Yes, not unusual in the world, not in politics and the Army, but definitely very highly likely happened here. So Mason's coming back with the Sultana. He's looking forward to getting from New Orleans. He's looking forward to getting these troops. He knows they're going to start sending them up the river. And matter of fact, before he got there, 2 steamboats had preceded him, and the Henry Ames had taken a load of 1,315 on April 22nd, and the Olive Branch on April 23rd had taken a load of 619, and they coming out of Camp Fisk. So he didn't want to miss that. So he managed to get there on April 23rd, the day after, actually the same day that Olive Branch left. But the problem happened. They are having trouble with a leaking boiler. So he doesn't want to tell the Army this because they may not give him those men. So this is where you come to a crossroads we all do in our life, a moral crossroad. You go do the right thing and maybe not get paid, or you do the wrong thing and get the money, but things don't always work out like you hope. So when he got back to Vicksburg with this leaking boiler in the evening, he immediately sent out his engineer from the boat to find a boilermaker to see if they can repair this. And then Mason went to see Hatch and said, "We got a deal. You want to confirm the deal?" And when Hatch called in a couple of officers, were working on this transfer of soldiers, and the decision was made to send the rest of the men from Camp Fisk. Well, there's supposed to be about 1,000, but big mistake. There's like 2,000. The decision was made, empty the camp and bring them on, so that's what they started doing the next day. They're repairing the boiler. The boilermaker had to do a Band-Aid repair, and while that's going on, during the night, he worked all night. The next morning, they're loading the troops on. And so nothing was ever said to the military people, and the boat kept getting more full, and it's overflowing. And the soldiers started to balk, like, we can't put this on there. There's 2 empty boats right there next to us. But no, the decision shouldn't be made, so they put all in there. And they're practically hanging off the sides. So you can imagine how crowded that could be. But they loaded them all day, and that evening they departed Vicksburg and went up the river. They're going up the river. The men have suffered through the war. They've survived that. They suffered through a horrendous prisoner of war camp. They survived that. So what's a little bit of discomfort for 2 or 3 days? They're exposed to the elements. Correct. That's right. They can't cook their food because they're on a riverboat. So they have hardtack and dry food, maybe some pork. But provisions were put on there, but they're dry food. And so we can put up with this for a couple of days. And they did. They went up the river, and fortunately for posterity, when they got to Helena, Arkansas, Helena, as you go up the river, is on the west side. There's a photographer there, and a good photographer knows a Kodak moment when he sees it, right? So his office was near the river, and he looked out, and the river's at flood stage. Matter of fact, Helena was flooded, but he's dry in his office. He's near the levee, and he sees this terribly overloaded steamboat. He said, "What a picture that would make." So what does he do as a good photographer? He loads up his camera, those bulky big boxes that they had back then, with 3 tripods, and he trudged up the levee and planted it and getting ready to make his picture. And because of him, we have the only known picture of the overloaded Sultana, which can be easily found on the internet and in books on the Sultana. And of course, the young men, being young men, when they saw him setting up, they all wanted to be in the picture. So they all went to that side of the boat and they almost capsized it.
Right, which touches exactly on what I was talking about earlier with it being top heavy.
Oh, it was definitely top heavy. There's a lot of men on top, but they're on the other decks too. But yeah, and then the officers in charge, including Mason, said, get back,
Mm-hmm.
And so they did. But it's sort of a comical moment, you can say everybody wants to get the picture taken, especially if they're going home. But it gives us a great look into what the Sultana was actually like, and that has been studied by the experts. So this was 7 o'clock in the morning when that happened.
One of the things that you just brought out that I want to, if I may interrupt, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no.
You mentioned that the Mississippi was at flood stage.
Yeah.
And that's going to be an important factor later on. because of why it's at flood stage. It's of course it's in April. It rains a lot in April, so we already know about that. But also, what's happening up north is that the snow is melting.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so the water is being greatly the level of the water is being greatly increased by melting snow. This is not heading down to the beach in the summertime kind of water. This is very, very cold, frigid water, and that's, I think, something that's important to point out here, why it was flooded.
Yeah, definitely. Something happens every year, and of course the Mississippi back then, without a very good levee system, flooded all the time.
Mm-hmm.
But that was the main cause, and not from a lot of rain, but from the melting snow from up north, which put it at flood state, which means it was about from the main channel, it could be a mile or 2 miles in either direction.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so that is important to know. So they're at Helena, next stop Memphis. This will be their last stop. Within 24 hours, everybody in that photograph I mentioned, taken by T.W. Banks, that was his name, in Helena, most of those men in this picture will be dead. They will perish in the Sultana disaster, including most of the crew and most of the passengers. But then 7 o'clock in the morning, take some rest of the day to get up to Memphis, and they arrive about 7 that evening. And then as they do in every stop, all these inland ports, they change in cargoes and passengers, and some of the men jump ship, like they've been here 2 or 3 days and they want to get something to eat. So a lot of them took off, and some of them got left, but a lot of them got back. And then finally it left about midnight, and it had to restock its coal, because it's the steamboat. It's burned coal to make steam to turn the engines, and then they start up the river.
An interesting thing, since you mentioned that, also one of the sabotage theories was that somebody had put a hollow log filled with gunpowder. Well, that's not true, because it was a coal burning steamer. It did not burn wood, so that was. If you enjoy the way we tell stories here on the Tennessee History Nerd, there's another show you might want to check out, Dauphin Island Diaries. Same approach, different setting. Stories from the Gulf Coast, rooted in place and built from the sources up. You can find it wherever you're listening right now. And now, back to our story.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that. The sabotage theory.
Coal torpedoes.
Having a piece of coal and putting a bomb device in it or powder is, I can tell you now, one of the probably the leading expert on the Sultana history is Gene Saliker.
Uh-huh.
He's written 2 books. He wrote one in 1996, his first one, then he kept studying it, and he wrote another one about 2 years ago. And I think it's the definitive work.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, Jerry Potter's book came in 1992. It's still good. But if you want to get him wound up,
right. Well, and the interesting thing was that was actually even an article in the Civil War Times Illustrated back in the 70s presenting that theory.
It raises its head every now and then. There was actually a lady a few years ago, 10, 15, maybe 20, who wrote a book about it. So that gets Gene really uptight. So they've had a discussion, professional, but he stands with what he believes, and he can document it.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's out there, but that's something that I don't mention in my talk on the Sultana unless somebody brings it up. Then I'll say, well, Gene Saliker doesn't prove it. So they did have to load up with coal, though. It is a coal burning boat, and start up the river. So everything's going well. They're churning away in the middle of the Mississippi River, a flood stage, and about 7 miles above Memphis. Now I can picture this. These guys at 2 o'clock in the morning, most of them are asleep. Some of them are all dreaming about home. Some of them are probably looking at the stars. Some might be just having a quiet conversation, but very, very peaceful. And then without any warning, there's a terrible explosion in the boat that rips right through the middle of it. It's like a case of dynamite going off. And immediately the Sultana is crippled. 500 men are immediately killed or wounded. A lot of them are trapped in the wood from the explosion. And that wouldn't have been so bad, except, as I just mentioned, you have to burn that coal. and it was scattered all over the boat. And the wood on a steamboat is light because steamboats want to be fast. That's important to have a fast boat. It's very thin. It's painted, has turpentine in it. Caught fire immediately, and then you have that nice breeze coming down the river, fanning the flames, and before you know it, you've got a burning inferno. And the tragedy of it, that those that lived through the explosion, they have pretty much figured out quickly. You got two choices. You can either jump into the frigid Mississippi River and probably freeze to death, or drown if you don't know how to swim, and a lot of these guys didn't know how to swim, or you can stay on the boat and maybe burn to death. How would you like to have that decision? And of course, there's immediate panic. Hundreds just ran off the boat into the water. The problem is, as I said, a lot of them couldn't swim, so there's people grabbing other people and pulling them down. They're drowning together. If you could swim, it may not help because you're pulled down by a non-swimmer. And it's just the worst tragedy as you could imagine. There's live witness accounts of those that took time and didn't jump in the boat into the water immediately, took time to think through the situation. They have reports of just hundreds of people churning in the water, and they're all screaming and hollering and praying and cursing all at the same time. It's just a terrible thing to witness. And out of all those people, the figure is 1,200 perished and about 900 survived. And there's all kinds of stories about how people survived. You know, they would get in the river and get a hold of some wreckage and float down the river till they get into the tall trees from the flooded Arkansas bank, or several floated down to Memphis, and they set the alarm off when they get into Memphis, like, help, and there's people out at that time of night, and so they sent out boats to rescue them. So some of them floated beyond Memphis to Fort Pickering and saved by the black soldiers down there. So this went on all night, and then finally they got some steamboats. It takes a while to get the steam up, and some of the private steamboats and some of the military boats were able to get steam and go upriver and rescue these guys who were just hanging on for dear life in the tall trees or where wood had collected. And a lot of them, they were so cold that they would just had to let go of their perch and fall in the river and die. There's all kinds of stories of that. They were brought back to Memphis. And if you're going to have a disaster, Memphis was the place because it was a military hospital town. Started off with the Confederates, and when that fell fairly quickly in the war to the Union, because of its location on the river and it's near a lot of battles, there was a lot of hospitals started there. So they had a lot of places to take these guys to help them recover. And then you also had help from the U.S. Sanitary Commission and the U.S. Christian Commission. These were private groups. They're just to help us. They did this all through the war to help the soldiers, bring them extra food, nurse them in the hospitals, write letters for them. They had a presence there too, which helped these men.
So one of the things that there are so many things you look at that went wrong. So many things that you can point to and say this made it even worse, and this made it even worse, and this made it even worse. One of the things that went in their favor was what you just mentioned, the fact that, number one, they were near Memphis, number two, that they were upriver from Memphis when it happened. Because if they'd been downriver from Memphis, nobody in Memphis would have ever known about it. That the people on the current floating by Memphis screaming and getting people's attention was what really got the alarm sounded in the beginning there. And I remember hearing of, one boat starts ringing its bell and suddenly everybody's ringing their bell and
yes.
and getting everybody, sounding the alarm and making sure they know that there's this horrible disaster that's happened.
Yes, and then as people woke up, a lot of them could look up a river and see it burning. 7 miles is not that far. And so I got their attention.
And it's floating, it's adrift. It's floating on the current coming back downstream until it snags as well. So
yes, it's disabled. There's no way to steer it. If they could steer it, they would have immediately gone over to the shore and let the guys jump off, those that didn't run in the river. But it couldn't do that, and so it just kept on burning and drifted over to the Arkansas side, where finally it landed, I think about a quarter mile from the flooded shore, and finally burned through the bottom and sank. The flagstaff was sticking out of the water, as I understand, and then that's where it was.
So, then with this, several things of note. one of the things I remember hearing about was the Sultana's mascot was an alligator.
Oh, yeah.
And so the alligator doesn't survive either, but the alligator's not killed by the blast. The alligator's killed by a guy taking his crate to use as a makeshift life preserver.
Yes, there are several instances where I was kind of referring to earlier, is those that didn't panic and kind of thought it through found ways to survive. And that's one of the more well-known one, is that they did have an alligator mascot, and because they had all these men on board, they put it in its crate, which is under the main steps. And one officer, Luganbill, had the presence of mind like, that's a great floating device. So he went in under the steps, found the crate. He had to, take care of the alligator, so he stabbed him with his bayonet, so he's not in any kind of a danger. Took the crate and threw it over the side of the boat, where there wasn't many people by this time, and he jumped in it and he floated to safety. There are several stories like this. There was horses and mules on the Sultana, which you haven't mentioned. There's probably, 80 or 100. And, of course, they have trying to survive the disaster, and a lot of them end up in the water, some dead, some alive. And the men saw this as a way to survive, grab these animals. And one man in the 3rd Tennessee Cavalry, I like to tell this story. He first grabbed a live animal, horse, and he thought that was a good idea, and it was thrashing in the water, and he couldn't hold on to it. He said, this is no good, I'm going to drown. So he saw a dead horse float by, so he managed to swim over to it and grab it and floated to safety. And when they had the reunions later, he liked to tell the story that was the greatest horse trade he ever made.
Right, right.
So they even found humor in that later on, But, it was a terrible situation. Mr. Keeble, let me go back to him for a minute. His son was Cy Keeble, the gentleman I met through the East Tennessee Historical Society. His dad's story is interesting. His name was Pleasant Keeble, and they call him Plez for short. He was there on the hurricane deck, the top deck, which is basically the roof, with his brother. And after the explosion, when men were panicking, he tried to find his brother, but he couldn't. And so his brother probably died in the explosion. So Plez, who could not swim, went to the side of the boat, and he saw everything was going on. And he waited till the wheelhouse, is the big wooden covering of the paddle wheel, fell into the water. And he said, oh, what a great flotation device, a big raft. So he managed to jump in and get over to the raft with about 10 or 12 others who had the same thought. And then there's a live mule. Again, back to the mule. This one's live, and the mule thinks that's a great place for him to be also. So the mule tries to get on board. Of course, he's going to capsize it. So Plez grabs a stick and starts beating the mule on the head and drives him off. So I like to say he was more stubborn than the mule. So there's another story.
Right.
And there's several.
What I remembered, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, they think that Plez's brother was somewhere near the stacks to stay warm. That was one of the things that was happening. A lot of these guys were intentionally finding a place over the boiler because that's where it was warm, and it proved to be a very unsafe place to be.
Yeah, a lot of men try to get near the boilers or the smokestacks, which is, of course, on the hurricane deck. And hurricane deck, again, is the top deck. And I always wondered why the two brothers weren't side by side, being brothers, but they were in different regiments. I mean, different companies, same regiment, 3rd Tennessee Cavalry. So probably because, Plez is the younger brother, and he got his company buddies, but he did try to go find his older brother and couldn't do it. A lot of tragedy. There was a lot of families on board with 2 or 3 brothers, or 2 or 3, a couple of brothers and a couple of cousins, or a dad. A lot of family members joined up in these different companies.
And among the civilians, I know there was a honeymooning couple that was on board. There was a family where a man and his wife and daughter were there, and the wife is the only one that survived. If you've been enjoying the Tennessee History Nerd, there's a way to take a little piece of it with you. We've got merchandise available, shirts, hats, and more, so you can represent the show wherever you go. You can check that out at summersmediaenterprises.com/merch. And as always, thanks for listening. Now, let's return to the story.
Yes, Annis. And Annis. Yeah, and I tend to, of course, focus on the soldiers, but there's a lot of tragic stories also with the passengers. There was one family called the Spikes family. They had, the number is something like, it was a man and wife, and they had like 5 children maybe with them, and a niece, and they all perished, but one of the young sons. So a lot of tragedy there also. And I want to mention John Simpson, because I'm going to come bring those two guys together here at the end. John Simpson was with the 3rd Tennessee Cavalry. It's his daughter, Mrs. Malcolm Bloom, who I met early on. And then it's Ples Keeble's son I met early on. So John Simpson was on the hurricane deck. Now, when it exploded, a lot of people died, but there are cases where they were blown away from the boat and they did not suffer any injury. And he's one of those that when he woke up, he was airborne. And then did a splashdown away from the boat, which got him away from the drowning men. And he grabbed a piece of wreckage and he was able to float to safety. So I've read that two or three times. So I want to mention them because they were big in the survivors' reunions that came later. So these men eventually, they were on their way to Cairo, Illinois. That was the destination of the Sultana. A lot of people, the way it's spelled, want to say Cairo, but the locals say Cairo. They were going to disembark there and get on a railroad train and go to Columbus, Ohio, Camp Chase, and be mustered out of the Army there. But of course, they never made it. Now, some of those that were not that injured in Memphis, or they recovered from the injuries, were put back on steamboats and finished that story, or that trip. And, of course, a lot of them, their nerves were shot, and they were just nervous the whole time trying to get on another steamboat and get to Cairo. So that was their destination, and then they came home.
I know there was stories of some of the guys who were from this area said, we're already in Tennessee. We ain't getting on a steamboat to go up north when we can walk from here.
Yes, there were several, again, because of the trauma. And then they say, walking was not unusual back then. And they may have been in the Army. They've been walking and marching for miles, hundreds of miles. There are some that just walked home. And there's one descendant who has a cane that her dad, not her dad, but her ancestor, had cut from somewhere. And he used a cane and during that long trek. And that's part of their family artifacts.
That's neat. So, were you planning to say anything more about Mason?
I should mention this because he, before they even left Memphis, he could tell this was not good. He didn't want all these men. He knew there was danger. He's been a steam captain for a number of years. And there's a report that, either before they left or during those few days that he was in the bar. It's a steamboat has a bar. And he was drinking, and he said, if I knew we could get to Cairo safely, I'd give all my worldly possessions. Well, he didn't get the opportunity. But once the explosion occurred, he survived that, and obviously, he was grief-stricken, and he did all he could to help the survivors by throwing chairs, doors, anything overboard that would float so people could grab onto him and try to save as many lives as possible. But he perished. He was never seen again. Yeah,
they never found his remains. But no, I just, one of the interesting things, and you bring up both of the things, basically in Vicksburg, as things are getting overloaded, he's starting, I think, to try to balk at a little bit of this, and the Army guys like, no, this is not your decision anymore, it's ours, and we're everybody's getting on this boat.
Yeah, he did voice his concern at one time, but you're right. No, he was just overruled.
Yeah.
Like, it's done now.
Yeah, the decision's already been made. And then yes, he did, I don't know that we could call it redemption, but he certainly did everything he could to save as many people as he could. There's reports of him ripping wood from, shutters off the windows, wood from the frames and all that, pitching it into the water to give people something to hold on to and try to save themselves with it.
Yeah, so several reports of survivors that mentioned that. So the guys come home. Those that survived, there were different states represented. I didn't really say that, but these guys mainly are Midwestern men from Michigan, Indiana, Ohio. And what's interesting, of all those Union men, you have about 400 Tennesseans on board. And I like to point out that these guys are from a state that has seceded.
Right.
But they had their convictions and they fought for the Union. That's where their loyalties lie.
Well, one of the interesting things with regard to the war is that Tennessee actually had more people fighting for the Union than all other Confederate states combined.
Yeah, and that may seem like a strange statistic, but
not the way Tennessee was aligned.
Yeah, right. That's what I'm going to say. Tennessee, East Tennessee, and we call locals call it Upper East Tennessee in the Tri-Cities area, was heavily Union because it was mountainous. They didn't have slaves. They were just mountain folks and farmers, and so their loyalties lied with the Union. Where the rest of the state, pretty much when you get in, it's starting to flatten out, going to Nashville and down to Memphis, and they had plantations. And when secession came, East Tennessee voted against it, and the rest of the state voted for it.
And in some cases, it took multiple votes to get them to vote for it, because I know even in Middle Tennessee, like the county I'm from, they first voted against it. For a lot of them, when Lincoln won was what changed their mind. But one of the ironies, one of the paradoxes of the war is that Middle and West Tennessee were both very much Confederate sympathy, and they spent most of the war in Union hands, and the East Tennessee was very Union in sympathy and spent most of the war in Confederate hands. It was just one of the paradoxes.
Well, yeah, that is interesting. Yeah, I hadn't really thought of that before. Yeah, so we were divided. Basically, the Eastern Third was Union, and there's a book written here locally in Knoxville by a doctor back in the 80s, and it's called Divided Loyalties, because that's what it was.
That's exactly right.
But there were areas of Union support in West Tennessee, and Jerry Potter can tell you about that. Matter of fact, because I understand he's working on a book on that.
Right.
On the Unions in the western part of the state.
Well, Carroll County had some pockets of that, and there were people in one town that would accuse the other town of helping Forrest and that kind of thing over there. So that was one of the things I found out when I was doing some research over there that was interesting.
So the guys come home and they start having families, and the war's behind them, and they have to make a living, get married, have families, and do all the normal things as veterans do. And then, as our veterans also do, when it came to kind of the late 1800s, they started having reunions. And as all wars, World War II, World War I is, the common thing. And they started having reunions. And the interesting thing is, there was two groups of survivors that having reunions. As I mentioned before, the Midwestern guys, after those got home, started having reunions up there, and that's where the Sultana Survivors Association started. But Tennessee, being way down here, these guys said, we'll just have our own reunion, because that's a long ways to go. Transportation was slow back then, so they started having their own reunions. And I have several photographs of these guys, they have a reunion, and of course it's every year, and they would have it as close or right on the date of the disaster, which was April 27th, 1865. And they would try to have that date or close to it, and they would oftentimes meet at churches like here at Mount Olive Baptist Church, which is really had their first reunion. And they would go to other churches where, guys belonged to had different faiths and go to different churches. Sometimes they meet on somebody's farm, and they would do that until the last one passed away. So we even have records of some of these reunions when they would take the minutes, and it would indicate who was there and give a very brief account of what they did at the reunion. And of course, those accounts started getting slimmer and slimmer. The veterans started dying off, and they just didn't spend much time reporting what they did, maybe just to start off a few paragraphs and became a few sentences. But typically they would meet at a church, they would have a picnic on the grounds, and it'd be all day long. And sometimes the attendance, of course the public was welcome to attend, could be 1,000 people. They would have speeches, they would have the men give speeches, they would invite politicians, and they would have singing. So it was just a good time. It's like a campground meeting. They would have all these things going on and meet all day on that anniversary date, and then do it again next year. And there's several times they would take group pictures, and I have some of those that I'll share with you of these later reunions later on in the 1800s, late 1800s. But they started to die off, and so it got down to where in 1929 there were only two survivors left, John Simpson and Ples Keeple. John Simpson, who survived when he was blown off the boat, Ples Keeple, who outdueled the mule on the raft. They were the last two in 1929, and I have a picture of that was in the paper. And of course, photographs back then you had to take them outside, so I've got them sitting in two chairs outside, obviously for the photograph for the newspaper. 1930, there was only one left. John Simpson had passed away, and then before 1931, Ples Keeple passed. Now he was the last. I have to be careful about this. He was the last of the 13th Tennessee Cavalry in the Knoxville area. Another one of 13th Cavalry moved to Texas, and he was actually the last one to die there. He died in 1941, if you can believe that. A few weeks or a couple of months before Pearl Harbor. So That was the last one there. One of the major projects of these men was to have a monument. Mm-hmm. They had asked the federal government for a monument and didn't get anywhere. Their fear was that this tragedy they had survived would be forgotten in history. At the time of the disaster did hit the headlines of several papers in the area and even across the country, but it didn't stay there that long. It was pushed to the back pages of the newspaper because several things were going on at the time. The disaster happened April 27th. The day before, April 26th, John Wilkes Booth, who had assassinated Lincoln, was found in a barn and was killed by the Union Army. Joe Johnston of the Confederacy surrendered the second large Confederate army in North Carolina. Lee had surrendered on April 9th, and he surrendered on April 26th. Lincoln, who was shot and killed, he was shot on April 14th, 1865, died the next morning about 7:30. He was on the funeral train, and on April 27th, it was still on its way back to Springfield, Illinois, where he was to be buried. People were focused on that, and they would stop at major cities in the Northeast on this circuitous route, and people could come by, thousands and thousands of people come by to view his body. That was going on. And frankly, people were had kind of been worn out with all the death and destruction of the war. So this terrible tragedy turns out to be the worst maritime disaster in American history, and still is, was pushed to the back pages and almost forgotten about. And these men, these survivors of the 3rd Tennessee Cavalry, and all those up north too, swore to each other and committed that they will keep the story of the Sultana alive till the last one perished, the last one passed away. And that's what they did. Why did Mrs. Malcolm Bloom come hunt me up at the Knoxville Civil War Roundtable meeting? She had it drummed in her head, keep the story alive. Ples Keeble the same way. And then the guys from this area realized probably one of the best ways to be remembered is to have a monument. So the federal government wouldn't give them one. Well, we'll just have our own, a good independent pioneer spirit. So through collection of money, they paid for this beautiful monument, Sultana Monument. It's made out of pink marbles donated by the Gray Marble Company. And they put it up in the cemetery behind us at Mount Olive Baptist Church. Right in the middle of it is where they have the Sultana Monument that's there to this day. Mm-hmm. And carved on the front of it is a likeness of the Sultana itself, the steamboat. And all the men, Tennesseans though, just Tennesseans,
right,
are carved. Their names are carved on that monument by regiment and company in alphabetized order. And so if you have a Sultana descendant, you can go up there and probably find his name, although we've added a few.
So just for everyone's information, I will be including pictures of exactly what he's talking about with this as part of the bonus material. So, if you want to you're not able to come to Knoxville for some reason, but you want to look and see, is your family member on there? I'm doing my best to get those pictures where those words are legible. You may have to blow it up a little bit to see some of it because, this monument is over 100 years old now, so it's a little bit more difficult to see, maybe perhaps in a photograph, but I am making sure to take pictures of every single name that's on that. I've already, before the interview today, I've already made my way over to the monument, and I've already taken all those pictures, so this will all be there, and also I'll have a video that has all of that on it as well. I panned over that. It's a 4-minute plus video where I took pictures of the whole, or shot video of the whole monument. To Norman's point, all of these are on all 4 sides of the monument. They are not just in one place. So you actually have to go all the way around the monument, and they are in multiple columns. Like on the back side, it's 5 different columns of names that are there. The sides each have 2 columns of names, and then there's multiple columns on the front as well as the image that Norman was talking about of the likeness of the ship itself, or the boat itself there on the front of the monument.
Yeah, and then these are all hand carved. As I said, now not everybody got on there. In the last 20, 30 years, we've been having annual reunions, like 38 years. Some people say, well, man, Scissors not there. So I find a marble company, and they will add that name for a price, of course. And so we've managed to squeeze in the names, and there's about 12, I think, we've added over time.
And it's, you'll be able to tell where some of those are when you see the picture, because, you can actually tell where they're not in the same place. Like, for example, one of them's actually on the base, and then there's another one that you can see all the names are neatly arranged in a neat row, and then there's one way up on the top above it. So in some cases they've had to put that that where there was available space.
Right. Yeah, we had to squeeze them in, and some of them we managed to find a little space at the bottom. It looks it looks fairly natural. We tried to get the the monument company to match up the carving as much as possible, but you can't do it exactly. But yeah, we just tried to fit them in. Finally, the last two we had to put it on the base.
Right. Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
You
ran out of room.
I should mention this. There's a wonderful photograph, just like there's one wonderful photograph of the Sultana at Helena on the morning of April 26th. There's one great photograph of the dedication of this monument on July the 4th, which is a good date to have a dedication of a monument of these Union men. July the 4th, 1916. They had a ceremony. It was a big deal. I read about it in the local newspaper. About 1,000 people. They had a judge give a nice speech, which I've read. I'm impressed with. And then they had them gather with the group picture, as we all still do today. And on either side of the brand new, spanking, white-looking pink marble that was quarried in Knox County are several of the survivors here in 1916. It looks like there's a little grouping of about 3 or 4 on each side. And they're survivors because 2 of them are holding rifles. They want to let it known. I was a soldier once upon a time. And Ples Keeble, you can always pick him out of a photograph because he looks just like Teddy Roosevelt.
Oh, wow.
He's a little short guy, mustache, looks just like him, and he's easy to pick out. John Simpson, not so much. He's tall, he has a beard. A lot of these guys had full beards, but pretty sure good buddies that they were, that Ples and John Simpson are standing next to each other.
Mm-hmm.
Another little tidbit, if you look in this photograph, you look, this is 1916, right? Mm-hmm. We're getting close to entering World War I.
Yeah, next year, the United States is going to be in World War I.
Yeah. So you see these 3 or 4 young men that look like soldiers. So I thought they were soldiers until our very first reunion here at this church in 1988. An elderly man came in. He says, "I'm one of the Boy Scouts that was in that picture because these are Boy Scouts." And he told the story, which is great. They were just camping at the bottom of the hill. July the 4th, they do what Boy Scouts do. They're camping. It's a holiday. And somebody went down to them and said, "Would you like to join in this group picture? This would be a good Boy Scout thing to do." And they said, "Well, sure." So they brought him up. They're in the picture. And what's a very nice touch is you see one of them holding a bugle, one of the Boy Scouts on the right. And I know this ceremony, according to the paper, ended with playing of taps. And I've got to believe that young man played taps to end this ceremony.
So yeah, that is a really. I'm looking at the picture that he's alluding to right here, right now. It's on the table, and it's just to describe it for everyone. It's obviously black and white, but it's yellowed with age. It's got kind of that sepia tone to it, and you can see ladies in very nice dresses and wearing their hats. This is a very much a formal affair, and they've got flags flying on each side and United States flags. So it's definitely nowadays, if we were to do this same thing, everybody would be out there in shorts and a golf shirt, or a T-shirt. They're dressed up. They've got their top hats and pork pie hats and wearing suits and ties. The women are very nice. This was a formal event. That's.
I think they're in their Sunday best.
Yeah, absolutely, and that it absolutely is what I nowadays you would not see it that way. People would be out there in tank tops and flip-flops.
Yes. We had our 37th reunion here in Knoxville. I should say this, our first 14 reunions out of the 38 were here in Knoxville. And so after about 14 years, one of our members had an idea, well, let's meet at a site that's associated with the Sultana story. So the first site, an obvious choice, was Vicksburg, where they loaded them up. Mm-hmm. And we met there 2 other times since then. And then since that time, we've been going around the country meeting at sites associated with the Sultana story. We met in Memphis. We met in Cincinnati, where the Sultana was built. We met at Andersonville because they had men on board from Andersonville. We met at Cahaba, obviously men, including 3rd Tennessee, were on there from Cahaba. And we've met
Helena. At Helena.
Yes, Helena. Yeah, we've done that. There's a fort there. There's enough there. Put a reunion together, and that's what I've done all these years. I've planned these, believe it or not. And before I do, I drive to the location and I make sure that we can have a good annual reunion, which means we've got to have Sultana-related sites. We've got to have ability to have a Saturday tour because we meet Friday night and Saturday. And even though it's not technically tied in with the Sultana, as long as it's got history, Civil War history, we do that. We've met even in Athens, Alabama, and have stood inside the fort at Sulphur Trestle. That fort's still there, and there's a modern 2-story house in the middle of it, almost like a mansion. But those people, having us appreciation of Civil War, they let us come visit there. And that meant a lot to the descendants of the 3rd Tennessee Cavalry, because a lot of them were captured there in the 9th Indiana. So we've done that. And then we came back to Knoxville, and this time I thought of something new, and we'll talk here in a minute about the new Sultana Disaster Museum that's going to open soon. And the person who's been ramrodding that for about 10 years is a judge, Judge John Fogelman, a judge from the Marion, Arkansas community. And he's done a huge amount of work because they had to raise $10 million. But he was here, and I had this idea when they had the ceremony on July the 4th. The speech was given by a judge, and now we have our own judge. I said, would you be inclined to give that same speech? And he said, oh, yes, I would. He did a great job, so we went back in time a little bit.
Okay. So one of the things I would like to do right now, before we go into talking about the Sultana Museum, you've talked extensively throughout the course of our conversation here about this organization that you are a part of and that you started. I want you to take a moment or two, if you would, and tell people. One of the things I know that I saw, for example, let me go ahead and mention very quickly. There's a great documentary. Sean Astin narrates it. Remember the Sultana. It's available on Prime Video, maybe available elsewhere. I watched it on Prime Video. That's where Jerry Potter told me to go find it, and that's where I went to. But one of the things that you mentioned, because you're actually in that, one of the things that you mentioned in that is that your group, of course, people are aging out. They're starting to, there's some dwindling going on. But you want to make sure that this story continues to be perpetuated. You want to make sure that it's not forgotten. And that's really what the whole point of my podcast is, to tell stories that we make sure that those stories aren't forgotten, that they're not only remembered, they're remembered correctly. So we want to be as accurate as we possibly can as well. I want you, if you would, to have the opportunity to tell people, how do they get in touch with you? What do they need to do as far as being involved within this organization?
Yeah, it's real simple. You just send me an email and say you'd like to join up. We don't have fees. I have about a 400 email master list, and somebody wants to join up, and you don't have to prove your ancestry.
You say there's friends of also.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. It's in her name, and friends. I'm a friend. Jerry Potter's a friend. Gene Salaker's a friend. Judge Fogelman's a friend. A lot of friends. But we have, obviously, a vast majority are descendants. And just say you want to join up, and I'll add your email address to my list. And then you will be kept informed of upcoming reunions, because I send out messages, not a lot, maybe a couple, 3 times a month, about upcoming reunions. And occasionally I'll find a story that is of interest, and I will send that out. And, of course, I'm going to tell all our members about this podcast when it comes out, so they can tune in. And if I have 500 email addresses, we have at least 1,000 members, probably more, scattered across the country. And these folks are scattered all the way across the country. When we have our reunions, I like to count the states. We usually have 12 to 14 states represented. So I guess I should give my email address.
Yes.
All right. It is... First part is starts with my last name. It's Shaw, S-H-A-W. Then clan, C-L-A-N, like a Scottish clan, because Shaw is Scottish, right? Uh-huh. So it's S-H-A-W-C-L-A-N, the number 4 at bellsouth.net. It's .net on the end, so be sure about that. And just send me an email, and I get several throughout each year.
And just in case, for some reason, you didn't understand what he said there. And that shouldn't be the case, but just in case, I will also include that in the show notes. Okay. So that, if you need to go back and find it, or hey, you listen to this and you're like, oh man, I forgot to write that down. Where is that in that interview? I'll make sure that that's in the show notes, so that, in fact, some of the people may not even hear this interview because this will be on Patreon. Whereas I'll include this in the show notes, actually the public show notes, so that people are aware of that as well, so that it gets included for anybody that wants to find that.
And I guess you'll be sharing in some way this the photograph of the dedication of the monument, and
I will be.
Helena.
That will be part of the Patreon bonus material. I'll include that like with the interview. I'll have another post out there that'll have all the pictures and stuff, because I've taken, as I mentioned earlier, took a number of pictures already of the monument. Mm-hmm. I'll also include these pictures in that grouping as well.
Well, okay. So, Liz, you want to talk about the new museum now?
Yeah, let's talk about the museum.
I think that's a great way to conclude. One of our dreams as an organization was to have a museum, and we have no clue how to do that. We just talk about it, Wouldn't it be great to have a museum someday? Well, it actually came about by different people with that interest and following up on it. And we had a gentleman who was lived in Arkansas, and he approached the city of Marion about having a museum. And he went to the mayor, and his name is also Fogelman, but he's I think the cousin of the judge. And he said, hey, you could have a museum here and bring in tourists. And, of course, that gets the politicians' interest.
Their attention.
And tourism dollars are a big deal.
Mm-hmm.
That's a big deal. And they're just a few miles across the Mississippi River, Marion, Arkansas, across the Mississippi River from Memphis, maybe 10, 12 miles. And so they said, yeah, they would like to do that.
And this is fairly close to where the Sultana came to rest. Mound City doesn't exist anymore, if I understand correctly, but this is like the next closest town.
Right. Mound City was the closest town. It was a small town. It just died. It didn't have any commerce after the war. And then the next nearest town is Marion, Arkansas, which is only 2 or 3 miles from where the Sultana rests. And I guess we should say that after it sank, the Mississippi River changed course, and the silt came down and covered it up. So basically now it's in the middle of a soybean field in Arkansas. That's where it rests, and the nearest town to that is Marion, Arkansas, and that's why they've taken interest in it. And so you can go there. So about 10 years ago, 2015, we had a reunion there, one of our reunions, and they opened at the museum, and most of the artifacts are from Gene Zaliker's collection. He's been collecting Sultana artifacts his whole life, so it's actually not being that big a museum. It's got a lot of artifacts in it. And then they've kept that open for 10 years, but the goal is to have a permanent state-of-the-art museum, and they've been working on that for 10 years. They had to raise $10 million. They've done it. They've been building on it for a year or so, maybe 2 years, and the hope is that this fall of this year, around Veterans Day, around that weekend, that's not set in stone yet, but that's the target, they'll open it up. And they're still, the last stage is to build the exhibits inside the museum. And they were fortunate to have a old schoolhouse with, lots of square footage that was surplus. So they have the framework right there, and they've been working on that.
It's actually they're working on it in the old gymnasium, are they not?
Yeah, the old gymnasium. So that's provided them a lot of space, and they added on to it a little bit. And it's just right there in downtown Marion, a small town. So it would be a state-of-the-art. And there'll be a great, I know it's going to be a great opening. They'll have speakers, they'll have events. So that's what I'll keep people posted about as I learn it with our members. And, of course, everybody's welcome.
And to that point, I'll go ahead and say this. Norman, make sure you keep me apprised of that. So that I can mention it when that time comes with that current episode, so that it's going out and everybody's knowing about it. I can say, oh, yeah, what you may remember way back in episode 10, we talked about the Sultana. I want to tell you this museum that they were working on is now open.
Yeah, I have your email address. I'll just add it. When we get home, I'll add it. It's that simple.
There you go. So, by the way, you just heard me officially join the organization.
And then cost you a dime. And I really appreciate the fact that you're keeping the story alive. That's what it's all about, and you've learned that over the last 2 or 3 days talking to me and researching. It was important to the survivors keep it alive, to their families, and now the descendants.
Well, I will share with you, and I know you've started listening to my podcast. You haven't heard them all yet, and I talk about this in the introduction. My mom was a history teacher, and one of the things that has been very important for her is that we keep some of these stories alive. There's and this is the subject of our episode 3. There was a resort hotel that existed about a mile from where I grew up. It's been gone since the 30s. There's hardly anything left of it. But it was an important part of Warren County's economy back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and it was a destination. And hardly anybody even knows about it now.
Oh, I know.
And so, Mom wrote a research paper on it for college that ended up getting published in the State Historical Quarterly.
Oh, that's a big deal.
It's a big deal. And so she's actually, interesting thing, and I thought about this as you were talking about these real sons, real daughters, and of course they're all gone now. But you had the good fortune of getting involved in this story at a time when some of those people were still around who could share with you, only one generation removed from the very person that was experiencing this. And Mom had some of that same kind of stuff. She was able to interview people who in their teens went to dances and went to functions that would be hosted by the hotel and would talk about those kinds of things. And she said, she's talking to these ladies who are in their late 80s at this time, and this is in the 1980s. And she said it was like I was talking to 16-year-old schoolgirls again because they were remembering those kinds of things. And but keeping those stories alive, we have been given the opportunity to be stewards of remembering these events that are important parts of creating who we are, how we got here. And I think it's important that those are not forgotten.
Exactly. And that's what we do, and that's what you do, and we all try to strive in that direction.
Mm-hmm. So, well, let me say this. I'll use the word providential, running into you and Fred that day.
Uh-huh.
And by the way, I'll mention this, Fred. I'll be getting with him later on at some point because he's already provided me a lot of information on rugby.
Yes,
which will be the subject of a future episode, and it won't be this season, but it will be coming at some point. And so, I'll be doing the same thing with him that I'm doing with you. But just how fortunate it was that we happened to be there at the same time on the same day, and and this has happened to me already. I've only been doing this about 6 weeks, and it's already happened to me multiple times that kind of thing has happened.
Oh, that's great.
So, but what I will say is I do have the good sense when good fortune like that drops in my lap to hold on to it and grab it, and certainly what we've done today, I really appreciate you spending the time. And again, also you were the one who arranged for the venue for us to conduct the interview. I want to say thank you for that. I also want to say thank you to the Mount Olive Baptist Church for allowing us to use their conference room. And of course, if it doesn't rain on us too hard, it's looking like it's raining again already. So if it's not raining too hard, maybe we can go over there and do a little bit more. I've already, while the sun was shining, I went over and shot some video and took pictures, but we'll head over, the two of us here now. It's certainly been a very interesting time to talk with you. Really appreciate you doing this. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and wrap up the interview here.
Okay.
Want to say thank you to all of you who are listening to this and who are doing what you do to support what we do. Certainly want to keep telling these stories. I find it very gratifying just how much interest there has been in what I'm doing, and I appreciate all that people are doing to try to help me out with this and keep what we're doing alive and keep it going, because it's the support of you guys that's going to make this continue to happen. So thank you very much for that. Thanks for listening. Have a great day. The Tennessee History Nerd is part of Summers Media Enterprises. In addition to the podcast, we produce short-form historical video content that you can find on our social media accounts on Facebook, Instagram, and X. And I'm also available on a limited basis for speaking engagements, presentations, and educational events. So if you're interested in having us to speak or collaborate with you, you can find more information through the links in the show notes. Thanks again for listening.